We all know the story of Robin Hood, the daring outlaw who robs the rich to give to the poor, champion of the oppressed and thorn in the side of the Sheriff of Nottingham. From the silver screen to medieval ballads, Robin Hood is a beloved figure who represents rebellion against injustice, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But how much of the Robin Hood legend is based on historical fact? Was there a real Robin Hood roaming Sherwood Forest, or is he simply a character woven from myth, hope, and frustration at the corruption of his time? In this deep dive into the origins of the Robin Hood story, we'll explore the real history behind the legend. We'll uncover the social conditions that gave rise to outlaws like Robin, investigate the lives of real historical figures who may have inspired the myth, and sort fact from fiction in the centuries-old tales. Along the way, we'll reveal shocking truths that challenge the popular image of this iconic figure. By the end of this journey, the Robin Hood you thought you knew might look quite different. To understand the emergence of the Robin Hood legend, we must first delve into the historical backdrop of medieval England, a time marked by deep social inequality, political unrest, and oppressive taxation. The period during which Robin Hood is said to have lived, roughly the late 12th to early 13th centuries, was a time of intense hardship for the lower classes, who bore the brunt of the monarchy's financial burdens. Medieval England operated under a rigid feudal system, where land ownership was concentrated in the hands of the nobility, and peasants were required to work the land in exchange for protection. However, life was anything but fair. The peasantry was taxed heavily by both their feudal lords and the crown, leaving little for themselves. The monarchy, especially during the reign of King John, 1199 to 1216, was notorious for its greed and mismanagement. King John's rule was marked by a series of disastrous military campaigns, particularly in France, which drained the royal treasury. To fund his wars and maintain power, John imposed harsh taxes, often driving people into debt and poverty. These conditions created fertile ground for social unrest. Unable to pay their debts or taxes, many men found themselves labeled as outlaws. In medieval England, being an outlaw meant more than just being a criminal, it meant being outside the protection of the law. These men, no longer bound by the legal and social systems of the time, often fled to the forests and wilds, living on the fringes of society, raiding travelers, and sometimes defying the authorities who oppressed them. In this world of economic disparity, corruption, and resistance, the seeds of the Robin Hood legend were sown. But the question remains, was there a single man behind the myth, or was Robin Hood an amalgamation of many? The Robin Hood we know today is a product of centuries of storytelling, his character evolving over time through ballads, plays, and later, novels and films. But the earliest mentions of Robin Hood paint a very different picture than the heroic outlaw we are familiar with today. The first recorded references to Robin Hood come from medieval ballads dating back to the 14th century, over 100 years after the time he is said to have lived. These early stories present Robin as a much more brutal and ambiguous figure. He was not the noble hero fighting for social justice that we see in modern adaptations. Instead, he was depicted as a common criminal, living by his wits and his bow in the forests of northern England. In the oldest ballads, such as Robin Hood and the Monk, circa 1450, Robin is shown as a violent and cunning outlaw, far removed from the chivalrous, moral figure we often see today. There's little mention of stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Rather, Robin's main concern is his own survival and besting his enemies. Over time, however, these stories began to change. By the 16th century, with works like Anthony Munday's The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, Robin had transformed from a common outlaw into a dispossessed nobleman. This shift in his character likely reflected the political climate of the time. Stories of noble outlaws rebelling against corrupt kings resonated with audiences during periods of political instability and class conflict. As the centuries passed, the character of Robin Hood became further romanticized. The outlaw of Sherwood Forest turned into a symbol of resistance against tyranny, standing up for the common folk against oppressive lords and corrupt sheriffs. This version of Robin Hood, brave, generous, and moral, became the one immortalized in countless retellings and adaptations. But was there ever a real Robin Hood? Historians have long searched for a historical figure who could have inspired the legend, and several candidates have emerged over the years. While no definitive evidence proves the existence of a single real Robin Hood, several men may have contributed to the story. One of the earliest figures associated with the Robin Hood legend is a man named Robert Hood, who lived in Yorkshire during the late 13th century. Records show that Robert Hood was declared an outlaw after failing to repay a debt, and his name appears in legal documents from 1225. While this Robert Hood doesn't match all of the characteristics of the legendary Robin, his status as an outlaw living in the northern forest certainly parallels the early ballads. Another potential inspiration for Robin Hood is Fulk Fitzwarine, a nobleman who lived during the reign of King John. Fitzwarine was a rebellious baron who led a revolt against the king, spending several years as an outlaw before eventually being pardoned and regaining his lands. Like the later versions of Robin Hood, Fulk was a nobleman who stood up to royal authority and was forced to live as a fugitive, hiding in the forests. Still, others point to figures like Hereward the Wake, a Saxon noble who resisted the Norman conquest in the 11th century. Hereward's life, filled with daring raids and defiance of authority, shares much in common with the Robin Hood legend, though he lived several centuries earlier. These historical figures, and others like them, may have contributed pieces to the Robin Hood puzzle. However, no single person perfectly matches the legend. It's likely that Robin Hood is a composite figure, his story shaped by the lives of several real outlaws and rebels who lived during England's turbulent medieval period. As the Robin Hood legend grew, so did the myths surrounding him. Many of the elements we associate with Robin Hood today, the green-clad outlaw who robs the rich to give to the poor, his merry band of followers, and his love for Maid Marian, were not present in the earliest tales. In fact, much of what we think we know about Robin Hood has been heavily romanticized. For example, while the notion of robbing the rich to give to the poor is central to modern portrayals of Robin Hood, this was not a consistent theme in the original ballads. Early versions of Robin were more concerned with defying the law and humiliating corrupt officials than with redistributing wealth to the needy. The character of Maid Marian, often depicted as Robin's loyal companion and love interest, didn't appear in the Robin Hood stories until much later, likely introduced in May Day celebrations that featured Robin as a folk hero. Even the famous setting of Sherwood Forest may not be entirely accurate. Early ballads place Robin in Barnesdale, a forested area in Yorkshire, though Sherwood, located further south, became the more popular setting in later stories. The transformation of Robin Hood from a violent outlaw into a symbol of social justice says much about how folklore evolves over time. Legends adapt to the needs and values of the people who tell them, and as society changed, so too did Robin Hood. By the 19th century, writers like Sir Walter Scott had turned him into a romantic hero, and this image has stuck with us ever since. Despite the differences between the myth and the historical reality, Robin Hood's enduring appeal is undeniable. Over the centuries, he has become more than just a character in old ballads, he has evolved into a symbol of justice, rebellion, and hope. Robin Hood's story has inspired countless adaptations in literature, film, and television. From the early ballads that kept his memory alive in the Middle Ages to Hollywood blockbusters starring the likes of Errol Flynn, Kevin Costner, and Russell Crowe, Robin Hood has remained a fixture in popular culture. Each retelling brings something new to the legend, reflecting the values and concerns of the time in which it was created. In literature, Robin Hood has appeared in works as diverse as Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott and Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, which became the basis for many of the modern interpretations. On screen, the character has been portrayed as everything from a dashing romantic hero to a gritty, realistic figure. Robin Hood's appeal lies not just in his daring deeds, but in what he represents. His story speaks to a timeless desire for fairness and justice, for standing up against the powerful and defending the powerless. Even today, in a world where economic inequality and corruption still exist, the legend of Robin Hood resonates deeply. So, was Robin Hood a real person, or is he simply a myth? The truth, as is often the case with legends, lies somewhere in between. While the historical evidence for a single real Robin Hood is slim, the legend is likely based on the lives of real outlaws and rebels who fought against the injustices of their time. More than just a figure of medieval folklore, Robin Hood has become a symbol of resistance, a hero for those who seek to challenge oppression and stand up for the downtrodden. His story continues to evolve, and as long as there is injustice in the world, the tale of Robin Hood will continue to inspire.